Good afternoon, and welcome to the Data and Disclosure session. I'm Bennett Freeman, and have the privilege of chairing this. And I'm a new associate fellow here at Chatham House, and I guess my past affiliation that's most relevant to this discussion is I was Senior Vice President for Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments for 9 years. So really look forward to this session. I want to just start by thanking again the conference knowledge partner, McKinsey & Company, and the valued sponsors, Visto, as well as Verisk Maplecroft. So first I'm just going to introduce the speakers and then come back to you with a few other preliminaries about how we'll run the session and then do a quick framing. But our first speaker is online from the South Coast, Lois Guthrie with the IFRS Foundation. And then we're going to come back to the room here, hi Lois, to Sasha Sada with the Financial Conduct Authority here in the UK. And then we'll go to Marie-Jose Privik with Visto, our sponsored partner. And then we'll go back on video to Eric Usher with UNEP FI, the United Nations Environment Program Financial Initiative, coming to us from Geneva. And then we'll wrap up with James Alexander with UK SIF. And they'll each speak for up to 5 minutes, and then we'll do some questions, discussion amongst us, and then open up to all of you for questions and comments, just much as we did in the previous couple of sessions. So this session is on the record. It's being recorded. It'll be available on demand on the conference platform after the conference. And we do encourage people to tweet using the hashtag that you have, I think, CHRSPBiz. And then you know the drill that those in the room raise your hand to ask questions, and a boom mic will come to you, and then I'll be monitoring the online questions when we get to that segment of the session. And then to the online attendees, you can submit questions during the course of the discussion, and we'll save at least 25 and probably 30 minutes for the questions both online and for the audience. So with that, this is an especially timely and important session. I think really all of them are today, but what I think is notable here is that we've seen, and those of us on the panel and many of you in the room have been players in the mainstreaming of ESG in recent years. And I would go far enough to say that there's been a surge of ESG in the last couple of years in particular for all kinds of obvious reasons that have been alluded to. But we also know that data and disclosure, at the risk of using a cliche, are the lifeblood of ESG. Data and disclosure are the essential underpinnings of transparency and accountability and ultimately of responsible business itself. And I think it's a fair observation that most of us would probably agree with, that we've seen over the last 2 decades an emergence of disclosure standards, all well-intentioned, of varying degrees of quality, many high quality, but at the same time, a profusion of these standards that are complementary for the most part, but some have appeared duplicative, and there have been issues of consistency and quality and comparability. And so we're really now in a, what I would call, to use a more American expression, a kind of shakedown cruise the next few years. We're already amidst it. We'll be hearing about it, of a kind of a rationalization and consolidation of the different disclosure regimes and different initiatives coming from both the private sector as well as from governments. And of course, we're all aware of the EU a draft put out last week of mandatory environmental and human rights disclosure. So we'll explore those issues from the different perspectives, rich perspectives that the panelists bring to the party. I just want to start, though, before we turn first to Lois, by just putting a poll question to you that you can answer, those of you online, but also those of you here in the room already have access to the way to get in. It was explained earlier to get into the poll function. So the question that we want to ask, and it'll be interesting to see what you think now and whether your views might evolve in the next 30 or 40 or 50 minutes, is how confident are you that current efforts underway will produce the greater quality, consistency, and comparability needed by companies, investors, governments, and other stakeholders? Are you very confident, just confident generally, or not so confident, or just skeptical of the whole proposition? So I really encourage people to weigh in and, again, see if your views evolve as you hear our distinguished speakers. So with that, let's turn first to Lois Guthrie, again, with the IFRS Foundation. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you very much, Bennett, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me today. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the results of that poll. But Bennett, as you rightly said, there has been this truly impressive effort by many organisations over the last 20 years to develop ESG, non-financial sustainability type reporting standards. And although welcome, as you rightly say, these efforts have been accompanied by concerns about variation in the quality and quantity of corporate disclosures, but also the frameworks on which they're based and the action and decisions taken by the users of information, both preparers and investors and others. So questions have been raised over the years about how to achieve greater consistency and coherence. And certainly, you know, I've witnessed these debates, proposals and inquiries over the last 20 years through different channels and organizations. But now, following the announcement at COP26 on the 3rd of November 2021, the ISSB has been established to produce requirements that result in globally consistent, comparable and verifiable sustainability-related financial information, which is designed to meet the needs of investors and other financial market participants. And this development is very much a response to demand for sustainability-related financial information with a focus on investors and other market participants. So now we have what I call an institutional home for the development of those standards, where we have, you know, the long history of the International Accounting Standards Board as our sister organization. So we have their expertise, their commitment, and their international reach. And there's a commitment certainly to follow a very inclusive and highly transparent process for the development of the standards, and that is consistent with the way in which IFRS accounting standards are developed. So some of the leading investor-focused sustainability disclosure organizations, some of the so-called group of 5 are being consolidated into the ISSB. I previously worked for the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and we were consolidated into the ISSB on the 1st of February 2022. So it's really only a month away, and I'm just a part-time special technical advisor, so just want to manage your expectations about the extent to which I will be able to inform you after just 1 month of part-time employment. And of course, as I think you know from public pronouncements, the VRF is on schedule for consolidation in Q2 this year. So what you will have seen is the prototype climate and general requirements published on the IFRS Foundation's website that were developed by the Technical Readiness Working Group. And our current work is to use those as the basis for developing exposure draft general and climate requirements, which the IFRS Foundation hopes to publish as exposure drafts at the end of Q1 this year for consultation during Q2. So those of you who have experience of developing these types of standards will know the complexity of the technical issues that surround these subjects, how to define a reporting entity and its boundaries, how to measure financial impacts of sustainability-related risks and opportunities, how to enhance consistency and coherence, measure and report on intangibles, what is the role of technology, and so on and so forth. And these challenges remain. But now at least we have a home where we can focus our expertise and offer an opportunity for thorough public consultation. So I just wanted to say that one of the questions that we've been asked to debate today is, does the creation of the ISSB go far enough? Well, it's certainly not for me to say, and I suspect we could debate for a very long time what is enough when as a society we're trying to address issues like climate change and sustainable futures. However, it's a very significant development. And I remember that back in 2014, the ICAEW did some research on the 10th anniversary of the EU adopting IFRS accounting standards. And they found, on balance, it seems likely that following adoption, there were overall benefits to transparency, comparability, the cost of capital, market liquidity, corporate investment efficiency, and international capital flows. So let's hope that if that's a barometer of success, we will be able to achieve that. Just two final thoughts. One is, having recently worked for the WBCSD, I've very much got my mind on preparers, and not at the foundation, but in my previous roles. One of the most commonly asked questions I got asked by preparers, how will I know when I've done it? So maybe that's the sort of success criteria that we could be looking for. But for now, though, we're continuing on developing the exposure drafts, and our hope is that you and all your networks will participate to offer your collective wisdom to make us successful. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I like your question, how will we know we've done it? And maybe we can get a sense of when that might be as well, how many years we're talking. But thank you so much for helping frame the big picture here, Lois. Sasha, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Just to bring it back to basics, I've been an asset owner, an investor for 20 years, and now for 6 months, I'm now the regulator of ESG for the whole of the financial services market in the UK. And it has been an amazing journey from where we used to, and there's a lot of friendly faces here, talking about ESG even 5 years ago was like, well, prove it matters and prove this and do that. And now we're suddenly, everyone is ESG experts. I'm on LinkedIn, and everyone I've known who never cared about it, used to harangue me for going into this, is now got ESG for 7 years. I went, no, they don't. So we've got to remember there is a lot of stuff going on here that is, now, I'd rather that than people ignore us. That's always better.
Yep.
But that means we've got a lot of work to do. So when you think, the reason I moved to the regulator is my one word, and it is a one word, greenwashing. And I want to make sure that asset owners, investors, consumers especially, but also all the regulators that I speak to around the world, have enough tools and information to be able to spot greenwashing, hopefully stop it, and get comparability, consistency, and the word that I really want to talk about is assurance that these numbers work. ISSB is a great start, and it's happened very quickly. So on the quick version, wow, excellent, fantastic. And I'm part of the crew that's using the headhunters to get the board together. I'm on the Sustainability Standards Forum to make sure that it gets a good start, and we try and merge some of the political wrangling that's going on in the world, because everyone wants a piece of this. You wouldn't believe how hard it is just to see where's the board meeting's going to be. We all want to change the world, but if the board meeting's going to be in Europe and they're not in America, or they're not here, or they're not there, then oh my God, it's ridiculous. But that's the real world we live in, I'm afraid. But it is good news. Couple of points I'd like to make really important. First of all, even when we get metrics, and we will get some metrics, and we'll get some soon, we've already had metrics on governance for years, and yet we've still got many people who, and I've just walked past the BP building, which I used to go into a lot as one of the largest shareholders, that they're now having to sell a certain governance stake for a very big loss. But is this new, this kind of governance issues? No, the metrics are there sometimes. They're just not enforced, they're not used, they're not there all the time. So even when we get metrics, we must make sure we use them, and we can make sure that people are enforcing because otherwise it just becomes fluffy, and we know that that can happen. Second, it's not just about equities. I think that's really important that I say that. I'm working very closely with private equity, the debt markets. They're the ones that are the biggest markets in the world. They're investors, and let's always think about investors because it's their money. They're the ones who own private equity. They do own debt. They do own equity markets, and they want some of this stuff on sustainability. And it's not just E. I can't wait to know one metric on political lobbying around the world from an ISSB metric, and then go, why is that company spending all of this money on political lobbying versus another? And as a regulator, I will be asking that to the senior managers who do that. And then lastly, consumers and investors are the users of these numbers. Everyone else wants a piece of that, and you can imagine, if you think everyone else is putting it on their CVs that they're in ESG, well then every politician is now suddenly caring about ESG. But we must remember what we're trying to achieve here. And when we go into the debate in a minute, I want you to realise that there's so many arguments that people are going to say about, oh, but what about this and what about that? Is that material to the business that I own or the debt of the market? And is it something that I can influence? Because otherwise we start going into random things, which are very nice, but they're not what this is about. And if we go too far too fast, we will do nothing. And I'm really worried that we will do that. So there's a lot of debate about materialities and stuff like that, and definitions and taxonomies. Can we just get on with stuff?
Yeah.
We do know what's wrong and what's right. There's enough work been done over the last 20 years, so we can just start and get on with things. But I am excited, but there is a bit of cynicism there as well.
Wow. Sasha, I knew you were going to be interesting. I didn't expect you were going to be so entertaining as well, having not met you before, but fascinating. And I like your sharp pragmatism there at the end of just get on with it. So with that, and I think that's a good transition to Marie-Jose, because what you do at Novisto really equips companies in particular to get on with it. So why don't you give us your perspective?
Sure, happy to be here. Thank you for having me, and I can't wait to get into the conversation portion of our panel, and can't agree more with what has been said so far. From my perspective, or our perspective, and where we are in helping companies with their corporate sustainability, particularly their ESG data collection. A huge driver of company behavior change and company reporting is investors, and investors are increasingly looking at environmental, social, and governance issues in making their business decisions, their investment decisions. To do that, they need decision useful information. What is that? Decision useful information is information, data, qualitative and quantitative, that is widely available, that is comparable between different companies, that is consistent over time, and that is reliable. And what does reliable mean? It means externally assured or audited, which some people debate are different things, but I think in the end will be the same thing. And what does that mean? How do you get that kind of data or information into the marketplace? In our view, in order for information and data to be widely available, it has to be regulated, because companies are going to have to be told you must disclose. To be comparable, it will be standardized. In other words, you're disclosing the same things, the same data, the same kind of information on, by and large, the same material issues, depending on the industry and the activities of the business. To be reliable, it has to be audited, externally assured, and so likely the regulations and the standards are going to call for the data and the disclosures to be externally audited. And to make all of that easier, or to help actually achieve that, it's going to be digitized. And so this is where we plug into the broader trend of digitization, or the digital transformation. It's happening in all aspects of business. It's happening in sustainability and ESG data collection as well, in an area where traditionally there has been very little in terms of rigorous data collection or verifiable data, and that's been one of the problems and one of the reasons why data has not been externally assured by and large to date. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the marketplace. We're seeing growing regulations that are forcing companies to disclose. In the EU, in the UK, very proactive in that area, but also in other markets, including in North America. And what's, I think, fundamental to remember is that regulations are not standards, standards are not regulations, but regulations are going to tell companies you must disclose, and you must disclose using these standards, so that it will drive the standardization or the standardized disclosures in the marketplace. Regulations are also saying your disclosures must be externally assured, and they are also saying your data must be available digitally. And so that digitization of the space, of the sustainability disclosure space, is also going to happen. And that will drive a mindset shift, in our opinion, from a communications exercise, not only to a reporting exercise, but very much to a data mindset, which is something that we are not seeing too much of in the space so far in sustainability reporting.
Thank you. Terrific. Eric, over to you from the UNEP FI perspective, having been at it for a couple decades as a key mover.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be in this very central discussion, I think, to the, well, much of what the sustainability movement is talking about, but what increasingly what the financial sector is talking about. Coming out of Glasgow, asked what the biggest developments were. Obviously, establishment of the ISSB is one of the two most important that I refer to. The other one is the UK government's announcement that UK corporations will need to issue transition plans. Because I think coming to the point that Sasha raised, you know, taxonomies, standards, all of these things don't mean much unless you have a holistic view about what this is about. Essentially, that this is a strategic issue that companies, corporations, and financiers need to be aware of in a holistic way. Then you need standards, you need taxonomies, you need the tools in the kitchen, as Mark Carney would talk about, the plumbing. But I think the more holistic expectations are very important. I think part of what's challenging, and just in terms of UNEP FI, for those who don't know, so we're the part of the UN that works with the finance industry, essentially to create the frameworks like the PRI, which was established in 2006, the Principles of Sustainable Insurance for the insurance underwriting, and most recently the Principles of Responsible Banking. So the wider, what we describe as frameworks, or essentially we say norms. So they're pre-standards, but they're essentially getting the private sector in a voluntary way to start to do the things that then start to influence the establishment of standards. And very importantly, the relationship between voluntary action, what we'd say the financial sector leaning in, and regulatory action. And things like the Tarek Fancy letter on BlackRock, we feel he has it sorely wrong, giving the impression that everybody should sit back and wait to be regulated. It doesn't work that way. What we need is we call it a dance. Private sector leaning in, showing how they believe it should be done voluntarily. Regulators are learning from, and this has worked very well in TCFD. We hope it'll work the same in TNFD. So you have this ratcheting up process of public and private sectors and actors working together. And we're also very involved with the GFANs, the net zero alliances. We manage 3 of the 7, including the one on the asset owners, which is the most developed, and also the banking alliance, which is very, very significant in terms of capital. But then begs the question is, what does it mean? And unless you have the standards, unless you have the disclosures, it's not going to work. And one of the things we're predicting is the targets are being set. Now it's not about commitments, it's about follow through and disclosure related to that follow through. It's got to be there where people are calling it out. And I think what we expect is quite shortly, it's going to be like the ESG space, that there are going to be so many asks so that investors who are committed to net zero, they're going to get overwhelmed with asks. And there's going to be a lot of apples and oranges and different forms of disclosures, and it's going to be a very confusing space. I think on the positive side, net zero or other SDG type objectives or sustainability objectives, they are holistic in terms of why you need to do taxonomies, why you need standards. But of course, unless we have a structure that works for the market and also has a sort of an on-ramp from voluntary private sector action to regulatory uptake, in the end, it'll end up being, as some of you said, fuzzy, and it doesn't really become central to business practice.
Thank you. Excellent. I'm just fascinated by your notion of the dance, the ratcheting up, and let's come back to that in a few minutes in the discussion. I'll have a question around that. Thanks, Eric. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bennett. And I'm James Alexander, Chief Executive of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association. We're the membership network for sustainable finance in the UK. Our members bring together £10 trillion of assets, and we're supporting them to drive forward their sustainability and also working with regulators and policymakers to change policy to enhance the work that we're able to do and to drive forward what we're able to achieve. I want to take a step back because I want to think about what we're actually trying to achieve with the regulatory environment, with the data, with financial services and other things. We're trying to achieve change in the real economy. We're trying to make dramatic change to the economy that we have right now such that we can be aligned with things like net zero, Paris alignment and other things. To do that, we need to create systems change. We need to deliver the really significant, substantial changes that will make our economy the economy that we need. At the moment, we're about 95% off that. Only about 5% of our economy is somehow sort of in some way aligned to where it needs to be. So what does that mean for the future of where we're going to go? Well, it means we've got to do stuff really bloody quickly, and we've got to do an awful lot of it. And so we I think to Sasha's point, we can't sit and wait for the perfect. We can't wait for perfect data or perfect regulations or perfect legislation to come through the system. We have to get on and get moving very quickly, or we're not going to make the transition that we need to make. And I think that's one of the key things. So what does that mean for financial services? Well, increasingly, and one of the things, I've been in this role for a year and a half, and one of the things I've been really excited about is the level of enthusiasm within financial services to play a role in this and to move things forward. And I think there was once a time when financial services said, well, it's not our job. We finance the economy as we find it. It's not our job to change the economy. But I think that's changed, and I think that narrative has gone away. And we're actually sort of seeing that financial services now recognizes that it has a role it can play. There are things that it can do, that financial services can actually have a really substantial role in moving the economy in the direction we need it to go. And I think that's an extremely positive and exciting development. I think, though, that's not to say that we don't need new regulation. I think we actually do. And it might surprise you to hear someone who represents the financial services industry saying that we need more regulation. Well, one of the reasons why is because a lack of regulation actually harms the people that are doing the most work in this space. And so we see people, members of ours, who are going really above and beyond to make really incredible sustainable products that any of us, our pensions might be invested in, and that could actually have really big impacts. And then other people, some of them may be my members, I'm not promising that every one of our members are perfect, but other people are saying, I've got their marketing department to produce a really nice brochure that has nice pictures of wind turbines and solar panels, and to a casual observer, you can't tell the difference. And that's a really big problem. And so that's why we're working with Sasha and we're working with others, because we want enhanced disclosure. We want to be able to see what's actually going on in an investment fund so that you can actually make a judgment on what's happening, and you can actually start directing the trillions and trillions of pounds that our members control, that G-Fans, this big alliance, has committed would move, can actually start driving in that direction and achieving the change. So what does that change look like? Well, part of that is the role of investors as stewards of capital. We own the companies, most of the companies of the world. Sasha talked about how he used to go into BP and engage with the management there. We have that ability to vote, to engage with management, to speak to management. How well are we using those tools that we have? And more importantly, how much public confidence is there that we're using those tools effectively? So when we say the reason why these companies that you might not like very much are in our portfolio is because we're actively engaging with their management and we're doing a huge amount of work with them. We need to build confidence around that. We also need to be looking at what we're financing and what we're lending money into. And certainly I think we've got to hold investments in a different bucket to financing and lending. There's been, I think, $4 trillion of new investment into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement was signed, of new lending into new fossil fuel projects since the Paris Agreement was signed. That's madness on a whole range of different levels and needs to be regulated in some way. So I think there's an awful lot that can be done and an awful lot that should be done. We're probably going to talk at some point today about transition plans, about the green taxonomy, about new disclosure and fund labeling regulations. These are all really important things that are happening, things that we are thoroughly supportive of, and things that need to move very quickly. I think we also need to start thinking about what are we talking about? Are we talking about net zero and climate change, or are we talking about ESG? Now, the brochure for this conference talks about this session being about ESG, but how much do we actually talk about the other things that fall under E, nature, biodiversity, water pollution, air quality, the other, species loss? How much are we talking about social issues like modern day slavery? How much are we talking about equality and diversity? These are all covered by the concept of ESG, and we still very much focus on climate change. We need to start broadening that perspective. And I think the other thing we've got to do, though, is to recognize that we can't outsource the solutions to all these problems to one industry or one sector. Financial services, much as I would like to think that we cannot solve all these problems. We've all got to play the role that we each can play, whether that's as company managers, whether that's as individual citizens, whether that's as legislators or regulators. We each have to play a role, and we have to do as much as we can to make things move. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So before I ask a question or two, I just want to come back with the poll results I'm seeing here. So again, our question was, how confident are you that current efforts underway will produce the greater quality, consistency, and comparability needed by companies, investors, governments, and other stakeholders? Very confident, 9%. Confident, 39%, that's better. Not confident, 43%. We've got some boo birds in the bleachers. And then skeptical, 9%. It would be, maybe we could take the poll again in half an hour and see if the confidence levels are raised by the panelists here. But so I want to start the ball rolling, and I'm going to look at the clock, and we'll take about 20 minutes on the panel and then open up. And I see a really good question already that's come in online. But I want to pick up with the phrase that Eric used in particular about the dance and the ratcheting up. And I'm sorry to sound American-centric, I try not to be, but I can't help but note and frankly worry from a global perspective about the fact that the EU and now the UK are really in the lead. And while Gary Gensler, the new Biden-appointed chair of the SEC, is moving on climate disclosure, we don't see movement in the US comprehensively across the board in regulation on ESG disclosure. Now, we were early movers. We did Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals, Dodd-Frank 1504 on extractive revenue transparency. In 2010, we did the California Supply Chain Transparency Act in 2011 that helped set the stage for the UK Modern Slavery Act in Australia and other jurisdictions. But I guess my question, just to start the ball rolling here, is as we're trying to drive towards greater standardization and comparability, do we have a US problem with the US not poised yet, despite having a Democratic administration, but problems, in case you haven't noticed, with the US Congress? Are we going to have a problem here with the US maybe lagging behind the EU and the UK in this drive towards consolidation, rationalization, comparability? What do you think? Any of you?
I'm happy.
Please.
You go first.
No, you go first.
Dealer's choice.
There's too many things to say, so I'll let you say some,
okay.
and I'll say others.
I'm less worried about it. I would have been more worried about it before. I spent a lot of my last decade fighting companies like Exxon, and Exxon lost a vote last year with its own investors and ended up with another 3 new board directors. I think it might have even been 4. So things are moving by the investors. And again, back to Eric's point about the dance, we don't want to wait. The investors didn't wait for a regulatory solution. Therefore, we have to, but of course, when you're dancing, you have to make sure hopefully you've got a partner, and you want to make sure that that partner wants to play around. So you have to make sure that you've got the auditors on board. You've got to make sure that you have got some minimum standards. And that's why I talked about private equity and debt. You couldn't now do a really good debt instrument in the US without Moody's and S&P saying something on ESG. So this stuff is happening because Moody's and S&P are doing something as well as investors doing something. So I think we're in a much better shape. Of course, there's more that needs to be done. And to be fair, I speak a lot to the SEC in my last 6 months, and they are working tirelessly to get somewhere. what we've got to make sure is we don't try to get them to go too far and then they get swamped by some of the politics that you'll know much, much better than I will. But we can get there, and I think we are starting to see some of these companies, and we're seeing even, God forbid, we're seeing what's happening after this terrible week that we've just had. It's not just European companies that are pulling out of certain areas, and they're not doing that because of just regulation. They're doing that because they think that's the right thing to do. So I am reasonably optimistic that we are moving in the right direction.
Good. I'm heartened to hear that. I didn't want to be a pessimist, but I do think thought it was a reasonable question. That Exxon shareholder vote was just amazing. I mean, and I've engaged Exxon over the years as Calvert, and they were kind of an iron wall, and it was finally breached. But extraordinary, and you're right to emphasize that investors, when they focus, have tremendous power, and of course we know the power of other stakeholders, not least campaigning NGOs going back a couple decades. Any others on,
I could follow up with a few comments.
Yeah.
So to answer the question directly, or is it a problem? It depends what you define by problem. Mm-hmm. Is it hopeful that the SEC comes out with, and for those of you who may be less familiar, the SEC has promised to come out with new disclosure regulations around climate and other ESG issues. They were supposed to do it before COP, after COP, 26, and then expected any day now. And so there's some challenges we understand internally from what we see in the press that it's between going, far enough or too far and withstanding legal challenges. Is it hopeful that they do come out with this regulation? Yes, because it will help drive change faster. Will it impede or curtail or stop the trend that's happening also in North America and the US towards integrating ESG into investment decisions, towards companies' disclosures? No, I think market forces are quite strong in North America, and they will continue. But maybe to expand the topic and to touch on some of the things that we said in our opening remarks, this dance concept, love the metaphor of the dance. It's really about all the constituents moving at the same time in the same directions. Regulators, corporations, and investors doing the same things with the same targets, looking at the same issues and taking action. And it's the change at scale. It's the system level change. It's the moving beyond the incrementalism that's really going to start to generate some results. And so that's why we're hopeful that the SEC will want to reclaim its leadership position.
Great. Hope so. Any other comments just to add on this question? Then I have another one in mind, but please.
I've got a few things
Please.
I could say. I mean, I think that we are now obviously operating more globally, and there's also it's not just regulators and politicians that control how things are moving. I mean, a lot of businesses are seeing that they're needing to make change in the way they operate because their customers are demanding it, because their staff are demanding it, because the management is being held under a lot of pressure to move things forward. And I think that's the case across the world. Obviously, we know very clearly what's happening here in the UK, but I think that is definitely the case across the across the world. What happens here in the UK and in Europe does influence what's going on elsewhere. So we have a few members that operate very globally. Their headquarters are not actually here in the UK, and they told us recently that the UK Stewardship Code has changed their entire global operation because of what the regulation that we have in the UK has actually influenced how they do things globally. Yeah. We mustn't underestimate the power that we have here in the UK. London is a really important market globally. The regulation that we're making can make changes and create waves globally, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that. I think there is one big distinction in philosophy that's happening between here and the US, though, which is the consideration of what is material, and it's about whether it's just looking at the risks, the external risks on your company, or whether it's thinking about the impacts that your company has, whether they're positive or negative, on the world. And I think that is emerging as a bit of a philosophical difference, and I think we need to perhaps bridge that gap somehow, and figure out ways that we can bridge that, and consider that actually the impact you have automatically generates risks, and then you are thinking about the risk that you're creating. But we're seeing litigation risks, we're seeing product risks, we're seeing physical risk. Those things are all happening universally across the world. So I think there are There are a lot of things that are moving that are outside the politics. But of course, America has lost a good few years of momentum, and that needs to be reversed.
You know, I'm so glad that you mentioned the spillover effect from one jurisdiction to another, and certainly the UK has had a huge impact really as a catalyst, as a model. And even though we were out first in my home state of California, the UK Modern Slavery Act really has had the most catalytic effect globally. And I can say, as somebody whose primary frame of reference in my own work is the S in ESG and business and human rights, labor rights writ large, that all eyes globally are on this new EU mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence directive, and it'll go through various iterations, no doubt revisions in the next couple of years, but the spillover effect is critical. I want to just pivot to a related theme here, and that is we talk about E, S, and G, and we all know so well how deeply and richly distinct each of those initials are, and their whole universes unto themselves. And again, I live largely in the S, but you know, what I'm wondering what your perspectives are is to what extent we're going to see data and disclosure emerge, consolidate the next several years that integrates where useful, and I don't mean gratuitously, but usefully, constructively, the E and the S and the G, where it makes sense. Now, maybe the most obvious example of the convergence of E and S is the climate justice agenda, where climate impacts, severe weather, have disproportionate impacts on poor communities in poor and rich countries alike. But another issue I just want to ask about is to what extent are we going to see disclosure and requirements that are going to strengthen the G over the E and the S, the governance. And I'm part of a conversation now with the World Economic Forum and others about strengthening corporate governance and specifically board oversight of the S, of human rights in particular, which has been a real weak link. And so my question is are we on to something here with this notion of integrating E, S, and G while still respecting the distinct subjects that each embody in a very huge and deep way, each and every one of them? But is there room here for integration, and especially the G over the E and the S?
I can try.
Lois or Eric, to you next, either of you, or?
I mean, one of the biggest, frustrations we see is SDG picking. Investors, publish and tick boxes. How many SDGs are they contributing to? And which keeps them very much in individual boxes. And I think it, as you've mentioned, the interrelated nature means that it's very hard to say we did this or we did that. And usually that ticking is backward looking rather than forward in a strategic sense. And so I think definitely the biggest challenge, and I think for ISSB, is the question is how can you capture approaches that think more about process change, which allows you to identify issues that don't fit in neat boxes. And just in the last year or two, from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter to Ukraine, none of these fit neatly in those boxes. And so unless we can have systems in place and teams and capacities to be able to identify it when we see it, then we know tick box approaches aren't going to solve. So I think that's really the biggest challenge here. And of course, one thing is establishing norms, but then as you go into really setting the standards and of course regulations, it's easy to fall back on saying, well, we're only going to focus on climate right now, and we'll get to the other stuff later. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, to say, well, does that work? We need to break down some of these barriers. I mean, part of what I find the net zero objective is so interesting is because, it blows out of the water the notion of materiality, because it's not a financial objective, net zero. And yet, why are so many stepping up to it? It's because it's got packed in it. And I think James has kind of referred to you can't separate out so easily the two forms of materiality, they're so closely knit. And I think, Sasha, you point out the challenge that what do you focus on is a key question. But I think it's this more holistic expectation that we need systems to be able to identify whether it's ESG or sustainability, how we apply it. The black swans as they arise using the system you have, rather than saying, oh damn, we have a system, but it actually doesn't apply to that event.
Thanks. Others?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, part of the challenge of having these kinds of conversations is there's so many different topics that are just going out in a whole bunch of different directions. I don't know if the question of are we going to integrate the E, the S, and the G together, if it's unnecessarily muddying the waters, because I think that there are E and S and G issues identified. And there are performance measures on those issues, and performance measures will tend to measure something specific. That's not to say they're not interrelated. They absolutely are. They're interrelated and they're concurrent. The social, economic, and environmental dimensions of our well-being are interconnected and concurrent, and that's this realization that is driving this whole trend to sustainability. I don't know if that's I think this is something that we may need to be addressing as we mature in our understanding of the issues and identifying what's material. And I think before double materiality, let's talk about materiality, and let's talk about companies focusing on those issues that are material to them. Again, whether they're material to their business or whether their business has an impact, is material in how it impacts the environment and society. But it's like not all companies are not going to need to address all E, S, and G issues in the same way. And I think they lose sight of that. That's the first thing companies should be doing is, okay, given the nature of my activities, given where I'm operating, what is important to my business? What do I need to be focusing on and managing, and then figuring out, okay, how do I measure with what can I measure, whether I'm doing a good job of it or not? I'll stop there, but just one point on the G to clarify maybe some confusion. G is for governance, and governance can actually be broken out into two things. One is corporate governance, which is the traditional corporate governance of board structure, board composition, board independence, the skills level and the makeup of the different directors, tenure and executive compensation, and those traditional corporate governance. And then it also covers all of those G issues that are the remit of the board or the governance body. And in there is climate change, because it is a systemic risk that companies are needing to address. There's also other issues like cybersecurity, but also culture and ethics, anti-corruption practices, and then integration of ESG into remuneration. And on your last point of integrating the S into governance, the law that you were referring to in the EU is about forcing companies to act on human rights and transition plans, and the plans aligned with the 1.5 degree target. And it is absolutely putting that responsibility on the governance body, because the governance body is responsible for compliance with the laws. And that is a mechanism by which you're bringing some of those S issues under the corporate governance umbrella.
Good, thank you. I see Sasha raise his hand, but I also want to make sure that Lois comes in here if you'd like now. I could go to you first, or
Yeah, I just had, sorry, Bennett. Yes, I just had 3 quick things to say on this very important question you raise about holism, connectivity, etc. So the first one is, I think lots of academic literature, I'm sure you're all familiar with, would put reductionism at the heart of lots of problems we're trying to solve now. So, clearly we need to, the holistic view, the dance you've described is clearly very important. On a practical level, if you look at the general requirements prototype that was issued on the IFRS website on the 3rd of November, you'll see that there's a whole section to do with connectivity, about the need for preparers to connect information that highlights relationships between different pieces of information, dependencies, trade-offs. A practical example in a car manufacturer, to what extent is the need to decarbonize affecting the just transition, for example. Those links have to be made. But the third point I would make is about the role of the reader of these reports, that having read lots of corporate reports myself, it is quite hard, I think, for the company with different editors and things to see that something claimed on page 10 may not be expanded where one would expect it to, or that there might be a contradiction that was not intended. So there's a level of investigation required here on the part of the reader to check whether the appropriate connections have been made, and we do get this holistic story that all of you are correctly referring to.
Good. Thank you. Sasha.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question, but and I'm looking forward to the S session afterwards. But look, at the end of the day, if you don't get the G right, you can play around all you like. And so, you know, we touched on it. Let's have a go again. But I mean, I've done it on many companies. But Exxon, you use the word iron wall. Change the board directors, then you get a conversation. Right. Then we can talk about E, we can talk about S, or whatever matters to that company that's material. So I think you have to get that right. Yeah. And that's really, really important. But I mean, the one thing I do like is I like to have fun in my world and stuff like that. And I get to meet some very interesting people who are chairs of companies and REMCOs and all this. And they all say to me, employees are our most important asset. I said, well, why don't you pay them a wage they can live on? Right. They don't pay them the living wage. So S is absolutely fundamental, but you need to get the data to make sure of it. And when we're doing work, and I'm challenging my own team at the moment on D&I, and we've now got 60,000 financial services companies that we regulate in the UK, and I'm saying, well, what's the data? And they're going, well, some companies don't give it to us. I said, well, there's a good culture sign. Right. They haven't even measured their own data on gender, yet alone on ethnicity. And I'm sitting there going, well, there's a sign that we need to be targeting that company. Right. So the culture and that side always links into it. So I think, well, if we get better data, we can use it. But I mean, there's so many examples. And the last one, you talk about just transition. We will be, and we are, looking at the green mortgage market. Right. But what I don't want from green mortgages is people who can afford to put loft insulation to get much better interest rates than people that can't afford it. So we've got it, and so that's a real practical example at the FCA where I'm working with the consumer vulnerability teams and stuff like that. It's not a big example, but it's a real example. Good,
thanks. James.
Yeah, I think building on everything that's been said on this, that, you know, we're increasingly realizing that we can't achieve one thing without achieving another. Right. And I think it's in my mind clear that you can't address climate change without also looking at the impacts that we're having on nature and how that's working. I think it's also, one of our strong views is that you can't get to net zero if you don't have a just transition. Politically, it just doesn't work. If everybody loses their jobs and if everybody loses their communities and livelihood, you're not going to get the political backing to move towards net zero. We have to think about these things as part of a whole. And I think, Lois's organization is starting to work on how to integrate TCFD, which is climate-related financial disclosures, into reporting. There's a call which we support, which is around TNFD, which is NATO-related financial reporting disclosures, which is possibly quite, the G7 endorsed it recently. It's likely to probably end up in the ISSB eventually. How long will it be before we just take out that middle letter? It's like T*FD, the kind of disclosures on anything kind of non-financial and or the financial impact of everything else. And so how do we start thinking about this as a whole and thinking about the whole thing? And I was going to mention the governance piece around remuneration, and you beat me to it. But I'll also talk about one other thing, which is another governance piece, which is there is a big campaign at the moment called Say on Climate, which is looking at having shareholder votes on company transition plans. Now there are some pros and cons for this approach, but I think the point is that there are people, now there's a lot of conversations going on about what is the right governance approach around how we support and work with companies to get them to the sustainability place we need to be.
Fabulous. I have one last question I just want to ask very quickly, and then we've got to go to the audience. We've got a few online and then in the room, but just on this G, I just got to get this out, and maybe you can each weigh in for 30 seconds on this. We talk about the huge importance of board directors, and my question is how well equipped overall are directors to handle data and disclosure and to have the fundamental expertise, whether it's environmental or social, to evaluate the data and the disclosures. And I can say that from my perspective, again, somebody who lives largely in the S world, that there's a striking paucity of directors on both sides of the Atlantic, especially on mine, who have much, if any, expertise on the S. We're seeing a little more in the E, but hardly any in the S. How do we equip directors? Any quick reactions? I want to make sure that Lois and Eric come in by video as well as quickly here on the panel in the room.
Well, Sasha said at the beginning that everybody's calling themselves an ESG expert right now, and I think that the reality of an industry that is emerging and is developing fast is that we don't necessarily have the skills that we need, and I think that's true, as much true at a director level. Pension fund trustees is possibly another example. You know, we've got to make sure that we are looking at the skills that we need across the piece at high level and just generally across institutions to deliver on this agenda.
Good.
Do you want to
Please, yeah, actually, let's go to Lois and Eric, and then we'll wrap up here, and then we got a few online and in the room. Please, Lois, Eric, you want to weigh in on this or anything else?
What struck me while you were speaking was the IASB, you know, the assurance standards. They talk about using an expert, and I think that, you know, that probably is it reasonable to expect a director to be really sufficiently well informed? I think they need to be sufficiently well informed to be able to make a judgment about advice from experts.
Right. Eric?
I would just add, at least on climate, what you know we're seeing is directors or CIOs, CEOs, they're pretty informed because they realize you don't change an organization without having the data. So I would say as compared to other parts of the organization, they're actually ahead in many ways. Of course, they're not specialists, but they you know, data prepared properly is decision useful, and that's what they're looking for.
Good.
I'll bounce off of that and say, yes, in the case of companies that have done the mindset shift to look at these issues, whether it's climate or other material sustainability related issues, and have not only done the mindset shift, but then have started collecting the data and are informed. I would reframe the question a little bit, because I think that, one, the most important thing is the mindset shift. You cannot convince a director that these issues are important and that we must transition to a sustainability mindset if they don't want to hear it. But once they hear it, it is a lot of common sense. And two, I don't think you need to be an expert. First of all, they won't be experts in all issues. I don't think you need to be a climate expert to understand that climate is real and we need to take action. I don't think you need to be a diversity and equity expert to understand that, you know, gender equity, gender diversity, and inclusivity of your employees and your board is an important issue, and you can have a pretty good idea of what the ratios should be. So, you know, I think the biggest hindrance to companies shifting their practices is tone at the top. It absolutely has to come from the board. If the board is not in, nothing is going to happen systematically. But it's beyond the expertise. It's just a mindset.
Good.
I worry that you put an expert on. I always worry about that. You can have an expert on cyber and they sit in the corner and they just ask them questions, and no one is an expert on cyber. So I really think I meet so many fabulous directors. They know, I mean, it's not hard to know about your employees or what matters. Yeah. You just need to make sure that they are equipped, and also that the regulations, we had to change in the UK, we had to, 5 years ago, Section 172, it's already there, it's boring, but it means it's not just about money.
Yeah.
It's about looking after your employees and your stakeholders and your suppliers. Once you know that, it's pretty simple for a board to be able to work it. You just need to make sure that they're equipped for it, and therefore training and all of those things.
It should be, but I have to ask, honestly, you know, how many FTSE 20 or Fortune 100 or DAX or whatever companies have most of their directors who at least know what the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are? I'm not sure that the numbers would be that persuasive, but
or the same with some of the investors, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to some of the online and here in the room. I just want to go first. There's a question from Yasamuni Kano, how would you evaluate the movement to end mandatory quarterly disclosure to give more focus on ESG disclosure? In Japan, for example, the government's proposal for that was not welcomed by the committee members from industries. Do you have some insights on pushing this forward? Great question. Anyone want to tackle that one? It's not just a Japan problem, God knows.
In my last role, we pushed very hard with other investors, some are in this room, to stop having quarterly reporting in the UK. And there's Marianne over there. We worked very hard on this, and we've tried very hard. We have got no chance in the US for now, but we have much more chance in other regions. Europe's been very good in that area, but that's the mindset of the board directors. Back to that, if they can't even want to get away from getting on a 3-monthly 100 days, then we really are, now they worry in areas that they are getting regulatory, but of course we've got to move away from that. If I've got 1 minute, I'm doing quarterly reporting, and then I've got a net zero 2050 target. I mean, how do you do both? I mean, it's just...
Well, Paul Pullman at Unilever, of course, was the first great big mover on this, and I haven't seen a hell of a lot of followers. Here's another one from Graham McMillan with First Avenue. Should we be in a position where net zero transition plans are mandatory across the whole of the OECD over time? That's a good one, I think, to take to Eric first.
Yeah, I think, yes, how it's done obviously will be very important. You probably, applying a comply or explain, in the sense of, I think we all agree what's not needed is regulatory approaches that are very, specific, which maybe are not fit for purpose. And it's very early days. Of course, the 50 is pretty easy. It's more the question about 2025 and 2030 interim targets. How do you set them? How do you report on them? I want to come back to your earlier question, because net zero is one of the things we're seeing that is really global. The GFANZ network for banking, I mentioned, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, when it launched, we had the 10 largest banks in Europe signed on, plus others in Europe. That's not surprising. Europe's out ahead, as we talk about. It also has the 10 largest banks in North America. So all the big Americans and also all the big Canadians, lots of fossil fuel exposure there. They're all signed on. It also has the 7 out of 10 largest banks in Latin America. And even places like Japan and Korea, where industries, big industry conglomerates have really dominated what financiers talk about. These financiers are falling over themselves because the industry conglomerates are realizing they need to decarbonize. So it's really a global movement, very powerful, mostly voluntary, but they also see the writing on the wall. And the UK was the first out, where they asked in Glasgow. Others are already talking about this, expectations on having transition plans. I think it's very good to set expectations. And then, of course, like with the TCFD, you're going to need to ratchet over time. But eventually, yeah, that's what we would expect. And I think TCFD is the same, TNFD probably as well. As I think most on the panel would agree that good regulations are needed in many areas, but that doesn't mean they have to come super fast. And not all regulation is good regulation. Obviously, it has to be done smartly.
Great, thanmaybe
maybe tie in a few of the different comments and we've heard so far in response to the question. The thing about climate that's very interesting is this global alignment is that we are aligned on the goals, the long-term goals, and then having to reach the interim goals. And so it's getting everybody moving in the same direction, connecting it also to the disclosure standards that are coming out. If you look at the drafts and the working papers, and the transparency is astounding from both the ISSB and EFRAG. But if you look at the working papers that have come out, first of all, they completely embed the TCFD framework. So the TXFD that you're referring to, I think, is going to be fully reflected in the upcoming disclosure standards. Those standards are also calling for forward-looking information, which is a novelty compared to traditional financial disclosures. And that means looking into the future, and it also means looking into the future long term. And so to the question on quarterly reporting, it's not that quarterly reporting is necessarily bad. I think it's a good way to keep track of what companies are doing. It's not necessarily a bad practice. It's just that it shouldn't it shouldn't be the only thing that companies are disclosing on. They should also be disclosing on their long-term plans, their long-term targets. And I think that needs to be maybe embedded in regulations. It's getting embedded in the standards. And if the regulations for disclosures are saying you have to use those standards, it's de facto going to be embedded in regulations. And I think that's something to hope for.
Good. Hopeful. So let's go to the...
Just quickly, I've got a conflict of interest. I am on the Net Zero Transition Task Force, so I'm going to say, yes, we definitely want it everywhere.
Good.
And we're just meeting for the first time very soon, because absolutely, I mean, if another company comes to me and said, I'm going to be net zero in 2050, I'll just shoot them, I think, because I'm going to go net zero alcohol consumption in 2050, but I'm going to have a bloody party for the rest of the next 30 years. So it doesn't mean much. What are you doing in 2025? What are you doing in 2030? Is it linked to pay? Is it linked to objectives? And what are we doing about that? And I think we really have got to stop having more targets and more aspirations and more detail.
Right on. Okay, in the room here, please.
Thank you. Great discussion, really exciting and really important. Sorry, Laura Kelly from the International Institute for Environment and Development. But I'm also getting frustrated. I'm hearing a lot about net zero. I'm not hearing anything about adaptation and resilience. And I think that's the real fear, that we focus so much, people get net zero, but what about dealing with the floods in the UK, the floods in Europe, North American fires, never mind what's happening in African agriculture. So I'd just like to ask a general question to the panel about how they think some of these issues around resilience and adaptation can get caught up in this debate. Thanks.
Great question. Let's go first to Eric from UNEP FI, and I want to give Lois a chance on this or the next one to be sure. But Eric, you want to take that? That's a great question. Thanks.
I'm just trying to, in terms of what I have said, let me pass on it. I'll come back if I have anything more specific to add. That's appropriate.
Someone else want to take a crack at that?
Sure. The TCFD definitely updated its guidance recently and have gone well beyond just the net zero. It's about the transition and the whole transition plan, not just, the net zero is a portion of the transition plan. And also don't forget the physical risks. And I think that's a very important message because most companies aren't big emitters. But most companies are likely to be affected either by transition or physical risks of climate or both. And in some cases, it's actually an opportunity. I think the tools are all there. And the standards that we're talking about, the ISSB and EFRAG, are reflecting that. They are reflecting that language around a holistic view to address climate. So I think this is everybody's, the tunnel vision on the net zero target. It's not because the tools aren't there and the mechanisms, the UNEP FIs and the regulators are not looking at a holistic picture. They are. So when we take the time to look at what the tools are that are available, we'll have them at hand.
Great. Let's go to someone else in the room, please. Yeah.
I'm Rohit from Environment Agency Green Finance. On a slightly related note, are we then looking towards a climate risk adjusted rate of return as part of the IFRS disclosures, the mandatory financial disclosures, that any physical risk that might impact revenues would have to be considered, and then the expected rate of return might see a change, or, for example, a project finance model, just talking from a modeler's perspective. Thank you.
Good. Let's give a crack at that to Lois or Eric first. Good question. Either of you want to come in on that?
I think from the point of view of what the prototype asks for, any of the published prototype, it does ask for information about adaptation, mitigation strategies, and so on, and the extent to which they might affect the assessment of enterprise value. So in principle, yes to what Rohit said, but in relation to the other things about whether it will affect, how that will be interpreted, that is up to the user of the information. So again, we go back to this dance that it's, perhaps needing to have some sort of assessment criteria that help both the preparer and the user understand how the information will be used in making these determinations.
Good, thank you. Eric, did you want to come in on that one as well?
I mean, just in different ways, we believe it already is being priced in. There are, it's this traditional process of managing risks that some of these already do show up and end up in the pricing. Of course, more transparency and more data will help improve that. But my expectation is absolutely it should be, and it will be.
Great, thank you. Let's go to someone else here in the room. I think yes, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Hi, Fiona Quinlan from Mott MacDonald. We've talked quite a lot, I guess, about the need to get on with things and urgency. But we've also talked about a number of kind of intricacies around, bringing in transition plans, international standards, bringing nature into that. And it strikes me that you could quite easily see, most companies' time and attention for these topics being devoted to getting that disclosure right for at least the next 3 years, let's say, which still brings us a lot closer to where we need to be, in terms of 2030 for the Paris Agreement. So I guess in a practical way, what do people see within their different kind of domains as being the way we really can just get on with it, and maybe, leave aside some of these issues and actually take kind of more practical steps?
Well, so for my practical steps, we have mandated everyone has to put a TCFD report. So we already had them, and I remember working with Mike Bloomberg 10 years ago and all of that stuff. Now everyone, asset owners, asset managers, as well as listed companies. So that has adaptation in there. So we really got to make sure that we do it. So not do something else on top, do that and do it now so that data can be used. By the way, just for your question, private equity aren't buying coal assets at the moment. So they're already starting to think, now they haven't done enough and we need much more, but already it's starting to happen in the real detail. And then the other one, we're doing labelling, which James mentioned. Well, James is helping and the team are helping. We need to make sure that the consumers, because my job is to look after consumers and investors and those people, will know what they're buying and have certain guardrails and know exactly, so we can reduce. I don't think I'll ever be able to stop greenwashing, but I really want to reduce it significantly. Labels, what does that mean, that product? What's it going to have? What's its objective? And that will happen very soon as well. So those two things are happening immediately.
Great. Eric, do you want to come in on this one as well? Or? Okay, let's see if anyone else here in the room. We've just got a couple more minutes. Yes, sir. Hi.
Super quick question. Are we going to end up with one set of corporate sustainability accounting standards or two? Because it seems like there is quite a clear bifurcation happening between the Europeans and ISSB dollars versus single materiality.
That is
Does that happen, and is that a bad outcome?
Yeah.
It seems like an okay outcome.
That's just about a perfect closing question for the whole panel. Thank you. Great. So let's just all weigh in on that.
I can start the conversation on that. Nothing is crystal clear. We are going towards two sets of standards, the ISSB and EFRAG. However, IFAC, which is the International Federation of Accountants, has come up with this building blocks approach as an explanation to how the two might fit together. ISSB is positioning itself as a universal baseline set of standards that are then adopted by the different jurisdictions and augmented or adapted, and the EFRAG European standards would be that mechanism to adapt it to the European market. So the answer could be yes, but they'll be intertwined somehow. We do have two international financial reporting standards that we've been living with for a number of years quite well. They actually collaborate quite a bit, so it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And the final point on that is the two, if you look at the two, are actually more alike than they are different. There are so many similarities in terms of the information that companies are going to be asked to be providing, the timeliness of it, the external assurance of it, the universal versus sector-specific versus topic-specific measures, and the connection to financial performance and the forward-lookingness and long-term plans. So I think they're going to be more alike than different. I don't think it's a huge issue if there's two.
Thanks. Quickly, others.
I personally think we will get one. I think we will get the building blocks. I'm using the Lego analogy, and you'll get the single materiality, ISSB, get there, and then others might want to add bits on top of it. You'll get the quantitative, and then there'll be the qualitative as well. But I think we will get there. There is going to be, as I said at some of these board meetings, there will be some fun and games, but I think everyone knows that 2 or 3 or anything else would not be the right thing. So we have to speak a language that can connect, and I think that will happen.
Good. So there's one last question online that actually feeds perfectly into this finale, and I just have to read it out because it's such an important dimension we haven't addressed. From Fardeen Dodo, to what extent might these emerging international ESG reporting standards and requirements be inclusive of and/or address downstream repercussions in developing countries? So if we could just, in any final quick 20-second comments from any of you, get a quick take on that, because our conversation is, I don't think, been sufficiently inclusive of repercussions in developing countries of what we've been talking about.
If the scope is
mean, there's
inclusive of the entire value chain, it'll look at that supply chain related issues, and that will pick those up, I'd say. But these are corporate disclosure standards. They're not meant to address macro level issues on their own. So I wouldn't expect them to do things that they're not designed to do.
Okay, Eric, want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's one concern on the climate side in terms of adaptation resilience, that more data could increase the cost of financing in countries who are least capable of facing climate change. So that's definitely a worry and a risk. But to some extent, I think that that's already getting priced in, and therefore, it just points out the need to be doing more about it in terms of building resilience. I think on the positive side, if we talk about net zero, we talk about holistic targets, and particularly 2025-30 follow through. For a group like HSBC, who just released their target of 75% reduction in the power sector, 34% in oil and gas, global targets, they operate a lot in emerging markets. And you can imagine that it should lead to actually increasing investment in low carbon in those markets, because it's actually going to be lower cost from a carbon perspective than doing it in the UK or in other places. So I think there's positives potentially and negatives to these movements.
Eric, thank you. I think that's going to be the last word. I want to thank you and Lois joining us by video, and thank Maria Jose and Sasha and James here with us in the room, and thank the audience for both the in-person and online questions. And we've got I think we've eaten into a couple minutes of the break, but we still have 27 or 8 minutes left, and then we reconvene at 3:45 for the S and ESG session to be chaired by my colleague Harriet Moynihan. So thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists and thanks to the audience.